For over a century, one of the most famous mysteries in American archaeology has been the disappearance of a civilization. Hundreds of stone villages, some of them 5 stories tall, abandoned across the Four Corners region of the American Southwest in the late 1200s. No bodies, no battlefield, no single catastrophic event anyone could point to. Just empty buildings and silence. The textbook name for these people, Anasazi, is itself a Navajo word. And what that word actually means has been quietly telling the real story the entire time. Modern DNA has now proven with genuine, peer-reviewed certainty that these people never disappeared at all. They moved. Their descendants are alive today, living in the same region, carrying the same genetic signatures their ancestors carried inside Chaco Canyon 1,000 years ago. The real question was never where they went. It was why nobody listened to the people who already knew. By the 1100s, a network of massive stone structures stretched across the Four Corners region of the American Southwest, covering portions of what is now Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico. At the center of it all sat Chaco Canyon, a shallow desert valley in northwestern New Mexico, holding some of the most ambitious architecture built anywhere in pre-Columbian North America. The great houses of Chaco Canyon were not modest shelters. Pueblo Bonito alone contained roughly 600 rooms, stood 4 to 5 stories high, and was constructed with such precise masonry that significant portions of the walls remain standing nearly 1,000 years later. A network of engineered roads, deliberately wide and remarkably straight, radiated outward from Chaco across the surrounding desert, connecting the canyon to outlying communities scattered across the plateau. Further north, at Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado, an entirely different kind of architectural achievement sat tucked into the sandstone cliffs themselves. Elaborate dwelling complexes built directly into natural alcoves high above the canyon floor, positioned so deliberately that the overhanging rock provided shade in summer and allowed warming sunlight to reach the interiors during winter months. And between these 2 anchor points, hundreds of smaller villages were scattered across the wider landscape, farming communities growing maize, beans, and squash in a region most modern visitors would consider too dry and too harsh to support that kind of sustained agricultural effort at all. Think about what that full picture actually represents. This was not a marginal, struggling population clinging to survival in difficult terrain. This was a genuinely sophisticated civilization, building multi-story architecture that still stands, engineering road networks across open desert, maintaining trade connections stretching hundreds of miles in every direction and sustaining that entire system across multiple centuries. Then, by the late 1200s, virtually every major settlement across the Four Corners was abandoned. Not destroyed. Abandoned. The buildings stood intact. The roads led nowhere. And the people who had built all of it, maintained all of it, lived inside all of it for generations, were simply gone. No bodies littering the floors, no evidence of a single decisive battle, no volcanic eruption, no earthquake, no sudden flood that could explain the departure in one clean, dramatic stroke. The buildings simply stood empty, exactly the way they had been left, slowly filling with wind-blown sand and silence. For a long time, the mainstream archaeological narrative treated this as a genuine, unsolved mystery. The word vanished appeared in textbooks and documentary titles with remarkable frequency, as though an entire civilization had simply dissolved into the desert air without leaving any explanation behind. That framing was always wrong, and the very first clue that it was wrong did not come from a laboratory or a genome or a radiocarbon date. It came from a single word, sitting in plain sight the entire time, applied to these people by the very group that arrived in this same landscape after they had already left. A word that every version of the official story kept using without ever stopping to think carefully about what it was actually saying. The word is Anasazi. It is a Navajo word, applied by outsiders, and it has been translated in several different ways over the years. Ancient enemies, ancient ones who are not among us, ancient strangers. The exact translation remains debated among linguists and among the Navajo themselves. But notice something that every single one of those translations has in common, regardless of which specific version you choose to use. Not one of them says vanished people. Not one of them says people who cease to exist. Every single translation, without exception, describes people who were here before us and are now somewhere else. The language itself, the very word the entire archaeological world adopted as its standard label for this civilization, was quietly telling the real story the entire time. The Navajo, who arrived in the southwest from the subarctic considerably later than the ancestral Puebloans had already departed, were not describing a population that had mysteriously ceased to exist. They were describing a population they understood to have moved. The word itself carries no mystery in it at all. It carries direction. It says plainly someone was here before us and they left. And the Navajo were not the only ones saying it. The modern Pueblo peoples, the Hopi, the Zuni, the Acoma, the communities of the Rio Grande Valley, have been stating the same basic answer through their own oral traditions for centuries, in their own words, through their own cultural frameworks. These are our ancestors. They migrated from the north. They came to where we live now. We are still here. That is not a single, isolated claim from one community. It is a consistent, repeated, independently maintained oral tradition preserved across multiple distinct Pueblo nations, all pointing in the same direction, all saying the same fundamental thing. The builders of Chaco Canyon and Mesa Verde did not vanish. They moved south and east, and their descendants are the people living in the Pueblo communities of New Mexico and Arizona today. Think about what it actually means that two entirely separate indigenous groups, the Navajo and the Pueblo peoples, each carrying their own distinct oral traditions developed independently of each other, were both telling the academic world the same basic answer for generations. And the academic world, for most of a century, treated both of those answers as folklore rather than evidence. Many Pueblo communities today actively reject the word Anasazi for exactly this reason. It is not simply a matter of linguistic preference or cultural sensitivity, though both of those concerns are entirely legitimate on their own terms. The deeper objection is that the word itself, and the framework of mystery it has been embedded inside for over a century, implies disappearance rather than continuity. It frames these ancient builders as a vanished enigma rather than as somebody's direct, living, identifiable ancestors. The preferred term among researchers and descendant communities today is ancestral Puebloans, a name that states the relationship plainly rather than obscuring it behind a foreign word, carrying the wrong implication entirely. For generations, two entirely separate groups of indigenous people were telling the academic world the same basic answer to the same basic question. One group's own word for the ancient builders literally meant they left. The other group's oral traditions said plainly, we are their descendants. The academic world was simply not listening to either of them. What it took to finally force that listening was something the field trusts considerably more than oral tradition: genetic data. Before the genetic data could address the ancestral Puebloans directly, it first had to answer a separate, equally important question. Where did the Navajo themselves actually come from? Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA studies conducted across multiple independent research programs over the past 2 decades have now confirmed what linguistics had already strongly suggested for considerably longer. The Navajo and Apache are Athabascan peoples. Their closest genetic relatives are not the Pueblo communities living alongside them in the modern Southwest at all. Their closest relatives live thousands of miles to the north, in the subarctic regions of Canada and Alaska. The Chippewayan, the Tlingit, the Gwich'in, peoples of the boreal forests and Arctic coastlines speaking languages so closely related to Navajo that trained linguists can identify the family connection almost immediately. Think about what that genetic and linguistic connection actually means, laid out on a map. The Navajo homeland today sits in the deserts and mesas of the American Southwest. Their closest biological and linguistic relatives sit in the forests and tundra of northern Canada and southeastern Alaska. The distance between those two regions is enormous, well over 2,000 miles of mountain, forest, and open plain. The Athabascan migration southward along the Rocky Mountain corridor represents one of the last major pre-Columbian population movements anywhere in North America. Genetic and archaeological evidence places the arrival of Athabascan peoples in the southwest sometime between roughly 1300 and 1500 of the Common Era, with some researchers arguing for slightly earlier dates based on scattered archaeological signatures. Here's the detail that matters most for the larger story. That arrival window, 1300 to 1500, falls after the ancestral Puebloan departure from the Four Corners, which is firmly dated to the late 1200s. The Navajo did not cause the Puebloan migration. They arrived in a landscape the previous occupants had already left behind. That timing has been confirmed most recently and most decisively by the 2025 Picuris Pueblo Genomic study published in Nature, which found no Athabascan ancestry in any Puebloan individual predating 1500 of the Common Era. No genetic mixing between the two populations before that date at all. Once the Navajo did arrive in the southwest, something genuinely interesting happened. Rather than simply occupying the empty landscape on their own terms exclusively, they absorbed significant elements of Puebloan culture directly from the Pueblo peoples already living in the region. Agricultural techniques, weaving methods, certain ceremonial practices and spiritual frameworks, a hunting-gathering people from the subarctic, adapting to a radically different desert environment, learned from the very communities whose ancestors had built the stone villages the Navajo were now living alongside. That cultural exchange is itself a piece of evidence worth sitting with directly. It confirms that the Pueblo peoples were present, active, and culturally influential in the Southwest during exactly the period the Navajo were arriving and settling, which is precisely what both groups' oral traditions have always said. Two populations arriving from completely different directions at completely different times, sharing the same landscape. And DNA now confirms both of their stories independently. The Navajo came from the north, arriving after the Great Migration. The Puebloans moved south and east, maintaining their population and their identity throughout. Neither group vanished. Neither group's story was folklore. But proving direct genetic continuity between the ancient builders of Chaco Canyon and the living Pueblo communities of today would require something considerably more creative than standard human DNA testing. Obtaining ancient human DNA from ancestral Puebloan archaeological sites is not a simple matter of walking in with a sampling kit. It is a politically and ethically complex process, one that involves real, living descendant communities with genuine, documented concerns about how their ancestors' remains are handled by outside researchers. A 2017 study that published genetic data from ancient human remains at Pueblo Bonito and Chaco Canyon without adequate advanced consultation with descendant Pueblo communities generated real, justified controversy across the field. So, a team of researchers led by molecular anthropologist Brian Kemp at the University of Oklahoma, working alongside CU Boulder archaeologist Scott Ortman, turned to the next best thing: not human bone, turkey bone. Here is why that substitution was not simply a creative workaround, but a genuinely sound piece of scientific reasoning. The ancestral Puebloans domesticated turkeys, kept them in pens, fed them, bred them across generations, carried them along when communities relocated. Turkey bones are abundant and well preserved at ancestral Puebloan sites across the Four Corners region, far easier to obtain for testing than human remains, and carrying none of the same ethical and political sensitivities. And a domesticated animal, moved deliberately by its owners from one location to another, carries its owner's migration history directly inside its own DNA, the same way a farmer's cattle or a herder's sheep track the movements of the people who raised them, generation by generation. The team extracted mitochondrial DNA from hundreds of turkey bone samples, comparing material from two specific regions. The first was the Mesa Verde area in southwestern Colorado, the ancestral Puebloan heartland, the place everyone agrees was abandoned in the late 1200s. The second was the northern Rio Grande region north of Santa Fe, New Mexico, the area where modern Tewa Pueblo peoples live today and where large Puebloan communities are known to have established themselves during and after the migration. The results were clean and remarkably direct. Before 1280, the turkey populations in those two regions were genetically unrelated in the maternal line. two separate, independent turkey populations, carrying distinct haplogroups with no detectable genetic connection between them at all. After 1280, the picture changed completely. Northern Rio Grande turkeys suddenly began carrying Mesa Verde haplogroups, genetic signatures that had previously existed only in the Four Corners region, now appearing for the first time in birds living hundreds of miles to the south and east. Think about what that single finding actually proves. People do not abandon their domesticated animals when they relocate permanently. They bring them along. Turkeys carrying Mesa Verde genetic signatures showing up in the northern Rio Grande at the exact moment the Four Corners settlements were being abandoned is not an ambiguous signal open to multiple readings. It is a direct, physical, genetically verifiable record of a population moving from one place to another and bringing their livestock with them. The turkeys tracked the migration. They carried their owner's movement history directly inside their own DNA, generation by generation, from the abandoned villages of the Four Corners to the newly established communities of the Rio Grande, arriving at a datable moment that lines up precisely with the known archaeological timeline of the departure. But turkeys, however elegant the evidence they provided, were still an indirect proxy. Proving direct human genetic continuity between the ancient builders of Chaco Canyon and the living Pueblo communities of today would require something the field had never attempted before. In April of 2025, a study was published in Nature that changed the terms of this entire conversation permanently. And the single most important detail about it is not the data it produced, remarkable as that data genuinely is. It is WHO initiated the research in the first place. The sovereign nation of Picuris Pueblo, a federally recognized Native American tribe in the northern Rio Grande region of New Mexico, approached the researchers themselves and asked for this study to be conducted. Not the other way around. The tribe came to the scientists, not because they doubted their own oral traditions, but because they wanted genomic confirmation on their own terms, under their own control, to support ongoing efforts to protect Chaco Canyon and the broader ancestral Puebloan landscape connected to it. Think about what that reversal actually represents inside a field that has historically taken indigenous genetic material first and asked permission afterward, when it asked at all. This was the first genomic study in American history initiated, controlled, and co-authored by a federally recognized Native American tribe. The tribe retained full ownership of the genetic data. They set the parameters of the research. They made the final decision to publish. Craig Quancello, who served as tribal governor when the research was launched, described the tribe's motivation in blunt, direct terms. Overlooked and erased is how the community felt. Their concerns about protecting Chaco Canyon had been treated by the United States government. This study was something they could do on their own terms. The research team, led by geneticist Tomás Pinotti, generated complete genomes from 16 ancient individuals buried at Picuris Pueblo, all dating from 1300 to 1500 of the Common Era, the exact centuries following the great ancestral Puebloan departure from the Four Corners. They compared those ancient genomes directly against DNA from 13 present-day members of Picuris Pueblo. The genetic signal was unambiguous. Direct continuity between the ancient burials and the living community. The same population, the same lineage, traceable across 700 years of continuous presence at the same location. But the study went further than simply confirming local continuity at Picuris itself. The ancient Picuris genomes also showed clear genetic connections to the ancestral Puebloan individuals previously recovered from Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, 275 kilometers to the west. A firm, measurable genetic link spanning both geography and time, connecting a living community in the northern Rio Grande directly to the builders of Chaco Canyon's great houses over 1,000 years ago. That result did something no oral tradition alone, however consistent, however widely maintained, had ever been able to do inside the frameworks academic archaeology is willing to accept. It provided hard, independently verifiable, peer-reviewed genetic proof that the connection Picuris Pueblo had always claimed to Chaco Canyon was not folklore, not cultural mythology, not a convenient narrative constructed after the fact to serve modern political purposes. It was biologically real, written into the DNA itself, readable across a millennium of continuous descent, confirmed by the most rigorous analytical methods the field currently possesses. And buried inside that same dataset sat two additional findings that, taken together, dismantle the conventional disappearance narrative more completely than any single piece of evidence published before them. The first additional finding struck directly at the heart of the collapse narrative that had dominated archaeological literature for decades. The genomic data from Picuris Pueblo showed no evidence of population decline among the Puebloan peoples before European arrival. None at all. Let that detail settle for a moment, because it contradicts the version of this story that most people have been taught. The conventional narrative, the one repeated in textbooks and documentaries for generations, described the ancestral Puebloan departure from the Four Corners as a collapse. A civilization in decline, weakened by drought, depleted by conflict, gradually falling apart until the remnant population simply abandoned what was left and scattered. The genetic data does not support that framing. The population did not decline. It reorganized. It moved. And it maintained its size throughout the transition, arriving in new territory with its demographic strength functionally intact. That is not what a collapse looks like. That is what a migration looks like, carried out by a population making deliberate, strategic decisions about where to go next, rather than a shattered remnant fleeing the ruins of a civilization that had already failed. The second finding addressed the Navajo question directly and decisively. The 2025 study found no Athabascan ancestry in any Puebloan individual predating 1500 of the Common Era. Zero, not a trace, not a faint signal that might be debated or interpreted multiple ways. A complete absence of Athabascan genetic input in the Puebloan lineage before that date. That result confirms, with hard genomic data, what the oral traditions of both groups and the archaeological timeline had already been saying independently for generations. The Navajo arrived in the southwest after the ancestral Puebloan migration had already occurred. They did not drive the departure. They did not pressure the Puebloans into abandoning their settlements. They moved into a landscape the previous occupants had already chosen to leave behind, for their own reasons, on their own timeline. Later, they entered territory that had already been vacated. Think about what these two findings, taken together, actually do to the conventional mystery narrative the entire field has been organized around for over a century. The ancestral Puebloans did not collapse. Their population held steady through the transition. They were not pushed out by incoming Athabascan peoples. The Navajo arrived later, into territory already vacated, and the living Pueblo communities of today carry direct, unbroken genetic continuity reaching all the way back to the builders of Chaco Canyon. Every piece of evidence points in exactly the same direction. The Navajo word for these ancient builders described people who left, not people who vanished. The Pueblo oral traditions said plainly, for centuries, we are their descendants. The Turkey DNA tracked the migration physically, haplogroup by haplogroup. And now, hard genomic evidence published in Nature, initiated and controlled by a sovereign Pueblo nation on its own terms, confirms the whole picture with a level of precision no previous generation of researchers ever had access to. What remains genuinely unresolved is not where the ancestral Puebloans went. That question is now answered, definitively, by multiple independent lines of evidence converging on the same conclusion. What remains genuinely open is exactly why they left when they did. Drought, resource depletion, social upheaval, shifting trade networks, internal political pressures within the Chaco system itself, all of these remain actively debated as contributing factors, and none of them has yet emerged as the single definitive cause the field can point to, with the same certainty it can now point to the destination. The word Anasazi was never a mystery. It was an answer, sitting in plain sight for centuries, spoken by the very people who arrived after the migration had already happened and found the buildings standing empty. The Pueblo peoples said the same thing through their own oral traditions, generation after generation, and were told it was folklore. In 2025, A sovereign nation took control of its own genetic data and proved what its elders had always known: a direct, unbroken line connecting the living community of Picuris Pueblo to the builders of Chaco Canyon. No population decline, no mysterious collapse, no disappearance of any kind. The ancestral Puebloans did not vanish. They reorganized, they moved, and their descendants are still living in the same region today, carrying the same genetic signatures their ancestors carried inside those stone walls 1,000 years ago. The only thing that ever actually disappeared was the willingness to listen to the people who already knew. Subscribe for the next investigation.